of the Israel-Palestine conflict. The past, the present, the future. The historical record, the human rights record, the legal diplomatic record. And we'll use the same standard of trying to use the most mainstream sources and see what they come up with. Obviously, it's a long history. Some people date it roughly, beginning of the conflict, from roughly the late 1800s, 1880 or so. So we're talking about 130 years. So I'll try to focus on what's alleged to be the most controversial issue, namely all those wars that have unfolded between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Barely a few years pass in that region without there yet being another war between Israel and its neighbors. The 1948 war, the 1956 war, the 1967 war, the 1968 through 70 war of attrition, the 1973 war, the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the invasions of Lebanon. And the obvious question is, what's behind all those wars? What's causing them? Why can't those people just get along? As Rodney King might have put it. You folks know who Rodney King is? I don't. So, how are we going to try to figure this out? Actually, we have a professor who has done us a big service in this regard. There's this fellow from Israel named Ze'ev Ma'oz, and he was the head of one of Israel's most elite think tanks at Tel Aviv University. And he recently came out with this very thick book. And it is a big book. If you put it on a plane, you would probably be taken off the plane because it would constitute a lethal weapon. It's a big book. And what he does in the book is the following. He says, I'm going to read, the book incidentally is called In Defense of the Holy Land. He says, I'm going to read all of the scholarly literature on all of Israel's wars. I'm going to just see what all these historians have written. And I'm going to try to synthesize their findings in one book. So he looks at the 1948 war, looks at what every historian has written in the 48 war. 56 war, same, 67, and so forth. And so the book is basically what's called a book of synthesis. It's an excellent book. There are some original chapters, but mostly it's taking what you would call secondary sources and just seeing what have historians concluded. Well, time doesn't allow me to go through all of his individual conclusions, but I can read to you his final conclusions. We're often told it's the commonplace assumption, the conventional wisdom. Israel is always engaged in wars of self-defense. Israel wants peace. And when it goes to war, it only goes to war because it's been imposed on Israel. Israel calls these wars of no choice. It had no choice in 48, no choice in 56, no choice in 67, no choice in 73, and so forth. So, Israel claims, and its supporters echo the claim, that Israel only fights no choice wars, wars of self-defense. And the second claim they make is Israel is always looking for a partner in peace. Give them a partner in peace, and Israel is ready, willing and able to resolve the conflict diplomatically. As Abd Aben once famously put it, the Arabs never miss an opportunity for peace. Israel is looking for the peace partner, but is forever despairing of finding one, except for the case of Mr. Sadat in the late 1970s. Well, what does Ma'oz conclude? Now, bear in mind, as I read you his conclusions, he is not rendering his own opinion. He is simply taking or making a synthesis of what all the historians conclude. First, in the question of war, he says, and I'm quoting him, Israel's war experience is a story of folly, recklessness, and self-made traps. Not one, that's not one, of Israel's wars, with a possible exception of the 1948 War of Independence, not one was what Israel refers to as a war of necessity. They were all wars of choice or folly. Not one was a war of no choice. Not one was a war of self-defense, with the possible exception of 1948. They were all wars of choice or folly. Okay, that's the war record. What about the peace record? Are you saying Israel doesn't want peace? Israel hasn't sought Arab partners for peace? This is what Mr. Ma'oz concludes. Israel's decision makers were as reluctant and risk averse when it came to making peace as they were daring and trigger happy when it came to making war. The official Israeli decision makers typically did not initiate peace overtures. Most of the peace initiatives in the Arab-Israeli conflict came either from the Arab world, from the international community, or from grassroots and informal channels. When Israel was willing to take risks for peace, they usually paid off. The Arabs generally showed a remarkable tendency for compliance with their treaty obligations. In quite a few cases, it was Israel, rather than the Arabs, that violated formal and informal agreements. We're often told, how can you trust the Arabs? How can you sign a peace agreement with them? How can you trust them to heed, to respect the peace agreement? It's a reasonable question, but it's put to the wrong party. Because based on the historical record, according to Mr. Ma'oz, the Arabs show a remarkable tendency for compliance with their treaty obligations. The problem of trust arises not with the Arabs, but with Israel. Because, says Mr. Ma'oz, it was Israel rather than the Arabs that violated formal and informal agreements. Let me now turn to the human rights record, the present, what's going on there. And here we have one of those peculiarities, you might call them idiosyncrasies or eccentricities of how our media report the Israel-Palestine conflict. Because what typically happens is there's some incident, say, in the occupied territories. The journalists descend upon the place of the incident. They ask the Palestinians what happened.